For a long time, company growth followed a familiar formula: more customers, more revenue, more hiring, more managers, more teams, more layers, more people. That was the logic. If the business got bigger, the workforce got bigger too. And for a while, that made sense. Because scale used to require labor expansion, more operations meant more coordination, more sales meant more staff, more products meant more support, more complexity meant more headcount. But that logic is changing. More and more companies now want something different: smaller workforces, better tools, higher output, lower overhead, fewer layers, more leverage. That is the shift. The new corporate goal is often not how do we build the biggest workforce. It is how do we get more from fewer people. That is why companies want smaller workforces with better tools. Not because labor stopped mattering, but because the economics of scale are changing. People often misunderstand this shift. They think it is only about layoffs, or only about AI, or only about corporate greed. Those things can be part of the story, but the deeper pattern is broader. This is really about how firms now think about efficiency. For years, many companies tolerated organizational bloat: too many meetings, too many managers, too many approval layers, too many duplicated roles, too much coordination work, too much work built around the work. That became expensive, especially once growth slowed, rates rose, capital became less cheap, and investors started caring more about margins again. At that point, the question inside many firms changed. Not how do we expand the machine, but how do we simplify it? That is where better tools enter the story. Because tools allow firms to redesign how output is produced. And once output can be redesigned, headcount gets re-evaluated. One reason this shift feels so sharp now is that older conditions hid a lot of inefficiency. When capital was cheap, hiring felt easier, experiments felt easier, growth covered mistakes, more staff could be justified, big teams looked ambitious, organizational sprawl felt manageable. In that environment, headcount often became a signal of momentum. The company is growing, the team is expanding, the org chart is getting bigger, the budget is increasing. That looked positive. But bigger organizations often accumulate friction. Communication slows, decision-making slows, responsibility blurs, meetings multiply, execution weakens, people spend more time coordinating than producing. Cheap money can hide that, because if revenue is rising fast enough, inefficiency does not immediately hurt. But when the environment tightens, the hidden cost becomes visible. That is what happened, and once the hidden cost becomes visible, smaller workforces start looking more attractive. This is one of the biggest reasons companies are changing. The modern workplace is now full of tools that compress labor: automation tools, workflow software, cloud systems, AI copilots, analytics platforms, project management tools, CRM systems, low-code tools, internal dashboards, collaboration software. Each one may look small on its own, but together, they change what one person can do. A smaller team with better systems can now often perform work that once required many more people. That matters, because once output per worker rises, the value of extra headcount changes. The company starts asking, do we need another person here? Or do we need a better tool? Do we need another team? Or do we need a cleaner workflow? Do we need more coordination? Or less complexity? That is the new equation, and in that equation, good tools are not just helpful, they become substitutes for parts of the old workforce model. A lot of corporate work is not productive work in the direct sense. It is coordination work, status updates, approval chains, meeting prep, internal reporting, duplicated communication, manual admin, repeated documentation, cross-functional confusion, follow-up loops. This kind of work grows as organizations grow. That is why bigger firms often feel slower. Not because people are lazy, because the system itself becomes heavier. Better tools promise something powerful, less coordination drag. If information is easier to find, dashboards are live, processes are automated, documents are generated faster, handoffs are cleaner, and communication is centralized, then fewer people are needed to keep the system moving. That is extremely attractive to management. Because coordination drag is expensive, it consumes labor without always creating equivalent output. So the modern company increasingly wants tools that reduce the weight of itself. This shift does not hit every part of the workforce equally. It often hits the middle first, the coordination layer, the reporting layer, the administrative layer, the summarizing layer, the process managing layer, the internal communication layer. Why? Because these roles often exist to move information between other roles. And when tools become better at moving, organizing, summarizing, and tracking information, some of that work loses scarcity. The job may not disappear all at once, but its leverage weakens. That matters because many modern organizations grew thick in the middle, not always intentionally, but naturally as complexity increased. Now companies are looking at those layers differently. They are asking which roles create direct value, which roles unblock execution, which roles are essential judgment points, and which roles mostly exist because the system used to be more manual. That is a painful question, but it is becoming a common one. The company model many leaders now want looks different from the older corporate pyramid. Instead of a wide organization with many layers and many support functions, the ideal is often a leaner core, supported by better systems, stronger software, clearer accountability, and higher output people. That sounds efficient, and sometimes it is, but it also changes the internal culture of work, because when firms want more from fewer people, expectations rise. Each employee may be expected to handle more tools, move faster, own more outcomes, communicate more clearly, and produce work that is harder to replace. That creates a more pressurized environment. So the shift to smaller workforces does not only change hiring, it changes what it feels like to work inside the company. The workforce becomes smaller, but each position becomes heavier. That is another reason this trend matters. Many companies wanted leaner workforces before AI, but AI made the idea feel more realistic. Why? Because AI does not only automate big, dramatic tasks, it compresses many small ones. Drafting, summarizing, research support, internal writing, document processing, first-pass analysis, knowledge retrieval, workflow assistance, meeting notes, administrative preparation. None of those alone replaces the entire workforce, but together, they reduce the labor needed for many white-collar systems. That is why AI matters so much here. It changes the perceived floor of how much staffing a company needs. Executives start imagining, what if this team can be smaller? What if this function needs fewer people? What if we redesign the workflow around tools first, instead of people first? That is a major shift in management thinking. And once leaders start asking those questions, the organization starts changing around them. This is not only a management preference, it is also a market preference. Investors often reward companies that show operating leverage, more output without equivalent cost growth, higher margins with flatter headcount, revenue growth without workforce expansion. Evidence that tools, not just labor, are driving scale. That matters because public companies and venture-backed firms alike feel pressure to prove efficiency. A company that can say, "We grew, but headcount stayed tight," often sounds stronger than one that says, "We grew, and added layers everywhere." Why? Because leaner structures imply control. They imply discipline. They imply margin potential. They imply scalability. So even if managers personally like bigger teams, the financial system may push them toward leaner ones. That is part of why this trend is widespread. It fits what markets increasingly reward. This is where the story becomes more complicated. A smaller workforce is not automatically a better workforce. Tools can reduce drag, but they can also create overload. If companies cut too deeply, people burn out. If they rely too heavily on software, new bottlenecks appear. If fewer people are expected to manage too many systems, quality can fall even if labor costs drop. That means the goal is not really small at any cost. The real goal is usually higher output per unit of labor. That is different, because it means the winning company is not just the one that cuts the most. It is the one that combines good tools, clear roles, strong operators, clean workflows, and enough people to keep execution from collapsing. So the shift is real, but it is not simple. The smaller workforce model only works if the tools and structure are genuinely better. If firms want smaller workforces with better tools, then the value of labor changes too. Companies begin rewarding people who fit that model. People who can work across systems. People who need less supervision. People who can use tools well. People who can own outcomes. People who can make decisions. People who reduce complexity instead of adding to it. That means modern firms increasingly want workers who are not just competent. They want workers who are levered. Workers whose output expands through systems, not workers whose contribution depends on constant coordination. That creates a tougher labor market, because many employees were trained for more structured, layered, support-heavy organizations. But the newer company ideal rewards autonomy, adaptability, clarity, and tool fluency. That is another reason work feels different now. The company is not just shrinking, it is redefining what kinds of employees feel most valuable. This is the most important idea. Older growth models often scaled through labor. Hire more people, create more teams, build more layers, expand the org chart. The newer model tries to scale through systems, better software, better workflows, better automation, better infrastructure, better decision tools, better data visibility, better internal coordination. That is a profound shift. Because once companies believe systems can scale better than labor, their hiring philosophy changes. Labor becomes more selective, hiring becomes slower, roles become broader, expectations become higher, and tools become central to the business model. This is not the end of work, it is the redesign of corporate scale. And that redesign is changing the structure of the company itself. Companies want smaller workforces with better tools because the economics of growth changed. Cheap money no longer hides inefficiency. Investors reward leaner structures. AI and software compress support work. Coordination drag became more visible, and firms increasingly believe that better systems can replace parts of the older labor-heavy model. That is the deeper pattern. The company is moving away from scaling by adding people everywhere and towards scaling by making each person, team, and system carry more leverage. That is why the workforce question changed. It is no longer just how many people do we need, it is increasingly how much output can the system produce before we need another person at all. The future company may not look bigger, it may look tighter, fewer people, better software, cleaner workflows, higher expectations, more automation, less organizational drag, more pressure on each role. That is why companies want smaller workforces with better tools. Not because labor stopped mattering, but because they now believe the strongest business is the one that can do more without becoming heavier. And if that becomes the dominant model, then the next era of work will not only be defined by who gets hired, it will be defined by how much companies think they can avoid hiring in the first place.